And it looks like we are live on YouTube. Welcome everybody to another NPM Open RFC call. Today's date is Wednesday, May 28th, 2022. We'll be following along in the issue that was created in the NPM RFC's repo, issue 594. I'll copy that to folks. And also spam here the meeting notes stock. Feel free to add yourselves to the attendees list there. As is usual, these calls and all comms on the RFC's repo are covered under a code of conduct link there. And we ask that you please be kind as others are speaking on this call, and raise your hand if someone else is speaking and we'll call upon you to talk. And just quickly, in terms of announcements, we want to reiterate that our majority of our team is headed out to OpenJS World 2022 here, actually. I've linked 2021 somehow, which will be in Austin in June 6th to, I think, the 10th. So we're also all going to contribute to the Collaborator Summit, which is just happening right after the conference as well. So we hope to see a lot of folks in person at the conference there in about 2 weeks. Also want to quickly highlight again the V9 roadmap that we've been updating. We've been making tweaks to that throughout the last few weeks. You'll see the issues hopefully getting more fleshed out as time goes on. And more details about the breaking changes, but also anything that should land prior to V9, including any sort of deprecation warnings or things like that in V8, which we've been trying to stay on top of and cut releases for over the last few weeks. So just quick reminder to go check that out. Feel free to give us feedback or comments on that issue thread, and appreciate folks like, I know Jordan has been keeping up to date with that, and just know that it is in flight. Sometimes we're working on it in real time. So yeah, I want to open the floor for anybody else if they had announcements they wanted to share or news. If there's nothing, we have a pretty small agenda today. Only 3 items, so we can open the floor up for other discussion topics if we want, or we can give folks time back today if we blow through the agenda really quick. The first item that we had queued up here is yours, Owen. It's the PR 593. This is essentially the idea of only installing registry dependencies and ignoring sort of other types of dependencies, or being able to configure essentially an install to ignore other types of packages. Sorry. Did you want to maybe speak to how you framed the RFC?
Sure. So yeah. So from the initial conversation, mostly moved the content one-to-one from the issue and more or less just fit it into the format of the RFC. I would say the part that got a little bit of a deeper dive was one of the feedback items about configurability of the flag, basically acknowledging like a silent warn or fail options, and suggested defaults from the outset, with the potential to tweak those in future Semver major versions, most likely from a silent to a warn. I don't think a fail would make sense, but yeah, I'll leave that up to you. And yeah, so just flesh that out with some more examples. And as far as prior art, I mean, all the major package managers support this URL and Git repo convention, but none of them, from what I see, call that out as a potential anti-pattern, at least from the context of our conversation. So I think it's an opportunity for NPM to be a first mover in this, which I think is great. Oftentimes, kind of help set the pace and commitment to security, which is great. I think for the sake, I'll pause in a second. So could definitely flesh out more from that bit of information, but I think for the benefit of this call, I did have a couple bike shed items that I think are worth chatting about in real time. Jordan's already spoken to a couple of them, so I can jump into those if there are no questions on what's presented so far.
Go ahead, John.
Yeah, so the comment I made was essentially I think that there should be the modes of operation, right? There should be the current behavior, obviously. There should be, I like warn. That's almost something NPM doesn't have to do as a semper major. It could just do, maybe. The problem though is that warning and failing are both modes that I'd want. But I'd also want each of them to have the granularity of directs only or include transitives. And so essentially I want 5 modes: silent, warn on directs, fail on directs, warn on everything, fail on everything. And the reason there is that I can control my directs, I can't control my transitives, but I still, if I'm lucky enough to have a dependency graph that already doesn't include non-registry dependencies, then I want to ensure that remains the case. And if I don't already have that, then I want to have the ability to check and see what I need to excise, even if I want the repo for everyone else to only fail on directs, let's say. Yeah, so I don't know the best way to bike shed how those 5 modes can be configured, but it seems important to me to offer all 5 right out the gate.
Yeah, I was going to end this by offering to actually work to implement this. So I'll acknowledge the additional cyclomatic complexity in that, but I have no disagreement with that on the surface level. But yeah, I think that's certainly worth opening for debate. So it sounds like the options are good in terms of the surface level to the user. Yeah, I could go either way. I guess I'm not sure what others think about being able to turn the dial on a per dependency type. I don't know if that then, oh yeah, direct versus transitive. I suppose that covers the spectrum of all dependency groups, I think we're going to call them, like peer, optional, all that stuff. So I figure it's one of 2 buckets, irregardless of the grouping or key in package JSON.
Yeah, and that's actually a whole other thing that I hadn't thought of then, is being able to set one of those 5 modes per dependency group, because maybe my dev deps, I don't care if they install non-registry deps, but my runtime deps I do, and vice versa.
Yeah.
So we've been having some internal discussion about this in a couple different ways. One, sort of what you're getting at least with all of these different wants, Jordan, is there's no really expressive way of creating sets and groups of dependencies, right? And so I think we're going to get there with NPM query, right? So like the dependency selector syntax potentially can help here in the future when we have that. But specifically for this RC, I think we've actually been discussing, instead of just the expansion of the dependency groups, and you're saying transitive versus direct dependencies, we've been discussing actually the types of dependencies. So like Git versus remote versus file. So those are the actual types that we were considering having individual flags for, because right now this is a Boolean for on off just on registry, and it basically ignores those other 4 or 5 different dependency types versus having 5 flags that are specific to those types. And the way in which we saw you working around this, in case you did want to potentially use Git dependencies or something like that, is you would explicitly, our recommendation would be to utilize overrides to essentially be the mechanism in which you opt into using, let's say, a Git dep for whatever reason you want to use a Git dependency for a transitive dep, you would actually have to explicitly opt into using an override, which would not be affected by those flags, right? So, and again, ours, and Luke actually brought this up in our internal conversation, the exact same thing that you were saying, having more granular, it'd be great to have granular sort of permissionings around this, but it becomes it kind of bloats config and isn't even as expressive as npm query will be eventually, that's right? True.
And it does sort of apply globally, right? Like in the same way is only dev or everything, or like only production or only dev or everything, right? Is sort of a mode that kind of conceptually applies to every npm command. I can see, without having an audit of them in my head, I can see almost every npm command also having a valid use case for saying, I only want to look at dev versus prod. I only want to look at registry deps versus file deps and so on. And so it does sound like a good idea to try and, with npm query in mind, think of a holistic way to provide that. But there's, I mean, like I still have open issues because I need npm explain to only work on production deps, because I don't care how it's there from the dev deps. I care how it's there from production deps, and that currently doesn't work properly. And we've discussed that before, but like it's another one in the long list of things where there's almost a universal need to be granular about what the command applies to, whether it's explain or ls or or this or various validations, right? And I'd probably want that on audit stuff too. And so it almost seems like something that should be holistically designed to work with everything and not one command at a time. And if it overlaps with query syntax, awesome, like there's some synergy, but like, yeah. So yeah, I don't have any ideas about like the implementation or the design. It's just sort of seems really important not to forget about all those use cases as we add new things, since the existing ones don't even meet those use cases yet and should.
Okay. Yeah, so go ahead, Owen.
No, I like the idea of using overrides as a kind of a short circuit to kind of what Jordan was saying is kind of like a V1, and then potentially, like you said, leveraging the query syntax to drill down per group or set, so you can opt in at any of those levels. But it's nice to have the override to just, escape and avoid the noise. You don't want it for one, but you don't want to turn it off for everything, because you're like, well, I'm only whitelisting, or I'm only allowing this one, but anything else, please tell me. So I think that, I think it would be great to be able to have a nice path towards interop with the query syntax stuff.
And another wrinkle here is that arguably this should be maybe like npm audit signatures, an npm audit thing, like an npm audit subcommand, like npm audit dependency types or something. And each of the npm audit things should eventually have a way to be automatically invoked as part of npm install. And right, as like in the same way npm audit vulnerabilities currently is. And then separately, every npm audit subcommand has a need for granular overrides, not like npm overrides, which are for swapping out deps, but for saying like, for this dep, I want this CVE ignored. For this dep, I want the license check ignored. For this dep, I want the dependency type ignored. And if we think of it more in that terms as an npm audit subcommand, and then also try and design a holistic way of granular ignore settings for npm audit things, then maybe that also provides the mechanism for like how you say what's permitted in your depth graph and what's not permitted.
Right. Yeah, like for me, I look at it as so there's two things with query. Query will eventually, I think, totally rework everybody's understanding of like making a query first before you do a command, even before you potentially even like, it's hard to think of doing an install and before doing query because you need to essentially have that information. So it's like that secondary install is like having that query syntax somehow applied to install, I think is important, being able to do that. But you can imagine that what you're asking for here is, I want to just exclude, I don't want to install essentially anything that isn't, let's say you only want to be permissive to registry depths. You can essentially exclude using the query syntax before you do an install, right? So the set already is like removing those depths from installation, from reification, essentially, right? So that would be the sort of thing which I think flips a lot of this on its head, where it's, you're actually like creating the set first versus passing a flag to a command. You're creating the set first and then doing the operation on top of it. So that's,
so would that be like creating a query string and saying, for what you were talking about, silently exclude everything that passes this query? Or perhaps a more restrictive setting, fail the install if anything matches this query, and then go try
exactly.
it.
Yeah,
Like
and it's similar to
that
audit.
Seems great.
Yeah, so it's similar to audit. Like imagine if you just said, like audit had like a warn if exists or something, like whatever. And the query is the key thing here. Query could be very robust in terms of, and is robust in terms of setting like vulnerable states to a package. So you can do the query for any vulnerable packages, pass that to npm audit, and npm audit is going to be the thing that throws in your terminal, right? So like that is then becomes, oh, well, npm audit is pretty dumb. It's really npm query that's going to be running the doing that filtering initially, right? So, and that's just these commands become like executing. So anyways, that's kind of like where my head goes in terms of like these sets and these groups, and trying to limit maybe how many more flags we introduce that like further sort of, I don't know, like further add sort of disparate ways of creating groups, and I don't know, like it's yeah. And until we have the query like command out, I think we should like pause any further kind of like nuanced aliasing, nuanced grouping, nuanced like mapping of depths to anything. This though specifically I think is tailored to output, right? Like it's more specific to like actually what we're going to do when we have found those depths, right? And so like that's where I'm like, okay, this totally makes sense, and we can potentially move forward with this, because essentially we're like warning on our best practices. And that's kind of where I also see what you said, Jordan, putting this in audit might make sense if it's like something that we think we should be permissive about, or like saying is not a best practice, like having get depths is not a best practice in your tree, right? Like,
but I mean, just saying what the best practices are is one thing, but giving people a trivial way to opt into enforcing those best practices and opt out of it, and then eventually having a major change that does enforce it by default, like that should, like the documentation is step like 0.5. The mechanism is step 1, and step 2 is making it the default. And so like, as long as that's the intention for all the things we've decided are best practices, then like, awesome. And yeah, so I like, overall, I like the direction. I think that the query syntax gives us a way to kind of universally add the granularity I've been talking about. We just have to make all the commands like obey it or whatever. But that just puts a lot of weight on you guys to do the work to implement it, since like if we're deciding that it's effectively blocking a whole lot of other things.
Yeah. So like originally internally, we've talked about this syntax where essentially we would add like a flag like ignore get deps. And then that is, that's false by default right now. And and you can set it to true to essentially like passing that flag would set it to true, and you would essentially be able to ignore get deps holistically.
Ignore
again.
Sounds dangerous to me. We like anything that allows someone to have a dep graph that isn't ideal, and then they don't know about it. That seems like a harmful setting. It should fail the install, and then tell them, here's how you can get work around it if you really have to have this bad thing. But like, we don't want to be making ignore the first class thing. That should be like after your CI has failed and everyone's alerted, then we sneak in and like, here's how you go ignore it. But like, we want
the only problem is the lock file right now, right? So like we are tracking these dependencies in the lock file. And like, again, we've just recently had this conversation, and it was in Slack in our team, and other folks can chime in if they want as well from our team. But I think the idea here is we would actually not want to put any of these deps that aren't a registry dep in the log file going forward. That was actually the thing that we are considering, and that's a major breaking change. So which is why, like, how do we get from where we are today to that future, which is we don't want to be storing in a log file something that we know is mutable, right? Like a remote, a file, a reference to get dep. Like we want to just like completely say, we're going to blow up if we see you trying to give us one of those types of deps. So blowing up in the future, that's totally fine. Saying that we can't generate a log file or something like that for you.
Right, but that's warn,
so
not ignore, right? Like ignore means pretend it's not there and actively prevent me from seeing it. And that is what I'm saying is harmful. Warning is great. Like, and then like, and it's fine to have a way to ignore them. It's just like, that should never be anyone's first resort. They should only be told how to ignore it once like they've been clearly told that it's bad. And warn and fail are like the things to get them there.
Sure. So we're saying that we could start warning on those types today instead, and then in a future major, I guess we stop supporting them in log files by default. And the only way that you can get a get dep, a file, or anything else is to use overrides. Like we're trying to make it tough. Like this is not like, we know that there's going to be people that are going to be angry about that. They've been using get deps as like private deps. They've been like abusing that sort of pattern. Mm-hmm. We know that this is not going to be easy. Not even saying that we try to do it for the next major just so we don't get slammed in, in the ecosystem, like by people being angry with us. But I think that this is the right path forward. Like there's no reason we have zero confidence in your log file right now, which is not good. Like, I don't like the fact that we are allowing for people to potentially be owned by somebody's changing or like a GitHub or GitLab account being removed and taken over or something, or a repo being essentially, replacing the source code in the repo, and essentially that you now have a different, you have different, contents and package, like a different package on disk now, even though the log file like is there to lock you into what you thought was the contents of your tree, right? Like this does not make sense. I don't know. So how we get there is interesting. If everybody is okay with that as a concept even, then I feel like, what Owen's proposed here and just warning in general might be a good path to start down. So, but I guess I would love to hear if there's like consensus that we agree that like we should be warning on these types of dependencies. Basically anything that isn't a registry or like a scoped registry config.
I'd be okay with the warn by default.
So warn by default and then opt in to actually failing?
Or silent, in theory.
Yeah, I mean, I would hope people would switch it to fail instead of ignore, but like, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, but so basically 3 different modes then. Silent,
Well,
warn,
but there's
default.
still, that's 3, right? I think we still need the transitive versus like all versus direct. Like, I think that always needs to be the case, because the only actionable things are the directs. And
But that's the,
yeah.
sorry.
No, go ahead. I mean, that's the query stuff, and I recognize that, but like that's I mean,
cool.
we already did it for npm ls, right? -- all. It does
the
directs by default. And go ahead.
The actual thing for install though is you can basically add, if you do not care about like if you do not want to meet or if you want to use a Git dependency, you can do that in an override, right? Right. So that's how you get around that as a direct dependency. Right. So you will not get warned, and you will not, the way that we would implement this is that like using an override essentially subverts that config, right? Like you are explicitly saying,
but I don't want to have to create an override for all of my transitive Git deps for things that I don't control. It's totally fine and reasonable to say, if you want a direct Git dep, you need to depend on it for real and then use an override to point to the Git dep. Fine, that's my own package JSON. You can make me do whatever annoying stuff I want there, right? But if I have 73 direct dependencies that each have like 12 layers deep, 3 different Git deps, I shouldn't have to load my package JSON with a bunch of overrides just to allow that. That's not in my control, right? Like,
that's the only way to like fix that.
And it's going to burn out maintainers if all of those issues are then everyone has to go file issues about it. So I hear what you're saying, that yes, eventually it needs to be warned on. There needs to be a way somebody can get the warning. But by default, we do not want to mobilize an army of users to go and burn out all the maintainers who are using Git deps. And currently there's no guidance that they shouldn't. So like, I think that it will always be critical to not complain about transitive things by default ever, because that always inevitably leads to maintainers getting harassed.
Does an npm already do that for other messages though?
It does, and we recently, I thought, discussed making the changes to deprecation warnings, so it only showed directs for this reason, because we didn't want to continue harassing maintainers with people seeing all these warnings about their transitive deprecations that don't actually matter.
I guess, do we think then the only way to educate the community is top down? I mean, I get what you're saying, but how do you know they're even there then?
I think that
how do we collectively know that they're there?
I think that the first step is telling people don't directly depend on Git deps. When that is established as a best practice, and when it's really easy for everyone to see when they're doing it, and when it's really easy to see, to get warnings about it, I think that's the first step. Because then, first of all, from that point, the likelihood that that all of the maintainers in question don't become aware of that best practice and adapt to it is small. And then second, if there is a way first for the extra vigilant person to opt into checking all their entire dep graph, then they'll see those warnings and the maintainers will get a few issues and there will be some pressure to migrate. But there's a big difference between that and every random engineer getting a warning about it and then going to complain.
So I'm totally on board with not trying to like send angry mobs of people against maintainers. I totally get that. I understand that that's kind of what happened with pure deps, like that, you know, that happened. Like we understand.
And it's been happening with deprecation warnings for a decade.
Sure, and we're trying to improve deprecation warnings now too, right? Like we have a ticket to modify that, fix that up. Specifically with pure deps, though, which is what I would liken this to. In terms of like the community needs to clean this up and like needs to become aware of this problem that exists within their packages.
But the transition is important.
Sure, exactly. How we get there is important. Yeah. And so Nilf was asking, you know, can we even find out about our own usage? again, once we have npm query, this will become a lot easier for you to find whether or not you are susceptible, or within your graph you have git deps or these different types of deps, and like you become aware of this. I know that ZB, who's come to these calls quite a few times, he wrote npm audit resolver. He's actually done some research in the space of the top 10,000 packages by dependence and their usage of git deps. Just recently, he did this work last week based on a Twitter thread, and came up with that the fact that they only found 84 packages that had git dependencies of the top 10,000. So it's not that this is like a crazy, especially within, I would say, the more sophisticated or more mature maintainers are definitely aware that they should be avoiding git dependencies. So it isn't that it's like super prevalent, but it's one of those things that is a security risk. It is an issue. It is a contract that we will break every single time, trying to tell the end user that we've created some sort of artifact like a lock file that is going to skewer them in and try to create like a immutable, reproducible build of their project. That's not possible right now if we allow for git deps and these other types of deps in lock files. So that's kind of where I'm willing to be more aggressive about getting to that future, because we're already like broken. We're already like the ecosystem is broken, right? Like your project is broken. We can't reassure you in any sense that you're going to get the same project if you run install twice. So that to me is like, whoa, we need a bug fix, right? Like we need a patch.
I agree, but I am confident that anyone who cares about reproducibility will will quickly opt in to checking their entire graph. Those people don't need any encouragement to go the most paranoid possible route. And those people also understand the context and will be able to file helpful issues and so on. And so I don't think that, I think that a staged approach is still going to be just as successful here. And yeah, as Nilf says as well, like this is much more important for production depths than it is for dev depths, which speaks to the need for type-based granularity. But there's an open issue as well about the ability to make a lock file that only locks down production depths, which has been sorely needed for a long time. So there's a lot of overlapping different things here that play into it, right? And I would use dev only lock files on all of my packages if they only applied to production depths, right? Like it's just that they don't, so I don't use them at all. So there's a lot of overlapping things here, and I think I think that avoiding maintainer burnout needs to be a very high priority.
So what are specifically for this RFC, so we can get going, and it sounds like, Owen, you're actually willing to do some of the work here, if we can come to a consensus on what we want to do. So in terms of next steps here, it sounds like we're willing to warn on anything that is not a registry dep. Is that what this group has kind of agreed on? We're willing to maybe ship a minor that starts to warn on install when we see anything that is in a registry dep.
Yeah, I would still prefer the style of deprecation warnings we talked about moving to.
Okay, so
I would prefer that style of warning where the directs are up front and center and the transitives are just a summary, and then there's a way to opt into all of them. That wouldn't bother me, because then the worst noise people get is a single sentence saying you have n transitive depths that use non-registry things.
Right. So it seems like because creating a new command or even nesting a new subcommand, like in audit, to get that information out, sounds like it should almost come secondary to us shipping query, because query we can quickly be able to say, sure, right, in a one-liner, we can give you that information. If you'd like to see those depths, you can run this query to get those depths, right? Instead of creating what we're proposing with deprecated even, we're creating a brand new command for information that you could easily get with npm query. Right. So it seems like we need to ship npm query first before we do the warnings even.
And possibly as well, like it will be heavily related, the subcommand specific config. I think those two things together, the thing where you can do a config that only applies to a specific subcommand, those two things together unlock a lot of improvement. Like a lot of RFCs will end up being implementable as a combination of those two, but not necessarily as one of them alone.
Okay, so it does sound like we're a little bit blocked on this, like until we cut query. Maybe what would be nice though is to modify this RFC a bit onto, I'm not sure if you've seen the deprecated RFC or deprecate, npm deprecate RFC, but we can share that with you to show you kind of like how we consolidated the log output for that. Because to Jordan's point, like, I think it would be like not a great experience if like you end up with like potentially 100 git deps and you get 100 logged outputs, warnings, or whatever. So consolidating those, I think, is important. And then we can bike shed the name of the flag. Like, I'm not sure if it's going to be whatever it is.
But a better one, only registry depths.
Yeah.
So just to clarify, so from what I understand, we want to predicate this on npm query already being available. And so I guess I'm not super familiar with that, so I'll brush up on it, but presumably, so I guess if you didn't use it with npm query, is there still like a default behavior? Like if you just run only registry deps, it would just warn across all your dependencies, and then you could drill down using query to be like only peer, only this, only that. So basically like a filtering system from that whole bucket that you would get by default. Is that kind of the way to think about this?
And I wanted to add, you said only registry depths. It's not actually that exactly, because files and links are fine. It's the only remote depths that you want are registry depths. So it's like, I don't like, this gets really verbose, but it's like you don't want any non-local dependencies except registry dependencies. So like, and again, at direct dependencies, files and links are fine, but transitively, that's not necessarily fine, right? Like, but like if you have a workspace, like, I don't know, there's a lot of subtlety here that where the real goal is to make sure that things are reproducible. And that means that everything has to be local or from a registry. And anything that is remote, it's not from a registry is the problem.
Yeah, I think local is also problematic for log files, right? So that's like,
why would that be problematic if it's a local file directory that also only has registry dependencies?
well,
Is that
you get
going to be
the point of,
reproducible on my machine?
well, that's yeah. So it's the transitive dep situation you were talking about. It's like, why would a transitive dep ever have, unless it was like a bundled dep? Like, why is it referencing a local?
Yeah, I mean, I have a predicate package that tests feature detects when export patterns work in Node, and it uses a bundled file dependency to do that, right? Like that works perfectly fine. It's perfectly reliable. There's nothing pulled except from a registry, and that should not start warning for people.
Okay, I guess remotes are the key then. That's the, yeah.
So only.
Like you want only locals and registries and nothing else, which is not, you don't want a tarball URL, you don't want to get dependency of any kind, you know, whatever else. I'm sure NPM supports a bunch of things I would be horrified to learn about beyond that, but you don't want any of them.
Is there a convention of these kind of things speaking in the affirmative? So would it be like only, like continue like the only XYZ depths, or could you invert and say no
unsafe remote depths?
Yeah, I don't know if there's a particular
I don't know.
affirmative tone that's preferred. So, okay, sorry. So does someone mind rewinding how I should update what we have so far? Just to, like, I guess, so is it for sure that we want to build on top of query, and then it sounds the other is the consolidated output. So
I think, yeah, those two things are like, so query needs to land before we can probably start work on this, but we can at least design this a bit more, clean this up to, like we said before, and like you just said, like clean up the warnings so that they're more in line with what we've done in other command, like npm deprecate. And I can, yeah, I believe that RFC is accepted and you can go check it out.
Okay. So if I were to update, I guess I think it's the implementation or whatever the section is that explains it. So there would be, so would there be so I guess what would be the default state with just the command as is? Is that worn on all or just worn on direct? And then
worn on all with transitives being in the summary output is fine with me.
Okay, with default being worn on all and summarize. Okay, and then with the inclusion of query, npm query, so then the examples we want to demonstrate how you can effectively override to your needs, like exclude or include a group of deps, or I guess with query, then we wouldn't need the override escape hatch at all. Would we just funnel everybody through using npm query in that case?
So install is not going to be aware of npm query or take a query flag for a while, like probably 6 months ish. Like it's going to be towards 2023, I'm guessing. Like we're not going to add support for the query syntax into the rest of the commands. I don't think. It'll depend on how work lays out, but npm query will likely be ready as soon as Roy's done typing. He's been working. Well, he's been working like a crazy person over there.
I mean, Owen, I would. Is there a reason why we wouldn't want to go with Owen's RFC being an npm audit subcommand that npm install runs by default, the same way it currently runs npm audit vulnerabilities or whatever by default? Because eventually, I want to be able to run npm audit signatures by default in install as well.
It's the only reason why I'm pushing back on just waiting until query's ready is just because there's no way for you easily to find those dependencies, right? There's no way.
I'm still saying we wait for query. Yeah. I'm saying both of those things, that the way that it be implemented is query is implemented first, and then Owen's RFC becomes npm audit dependency types or something. And then npm install also, at the same time as that subcommand is introduced, npm install runs it by default, and there's some command specific config for install that you can skip it, right? Like, and that way people can run it themselves. All the configuration is there, and npm install just invokes it, and the command specific config means you don't have to pollute the install config with anything except do you run this or not? And then all the config they want for npm audit dependency types can be command specific config there. That's why I'm saying both of those features kind of gate a lot of stuff.
Yeah, I'd have to think about
otherwise
that.
there's a ton of config pollution for the query stuff, right? And like, but if it's everything is constructed as composably, where you have a bunch of npm audit subcommands for all the checky things, and other things run those, then command specific config for the npm audit thing, like, becomes a very clean way to address it.
I guess the only thing I'm considering is like what happens to the log files, right, with these flags. Like, do they affect the log files at all? So like, we're just warning right now. Are we planning to do anything with log files before the next
Well, I would assume that warn and fail are both options for this npm audit subcommand. So if you set it to fail, like that would be like an install thing, like fail the install if the dependency type audit fails. And then
we don't
like
fail for any audit failure right now.
Not currently, but we should eventually. I mean, the whole point of running the npm audit, like npm audit in install, is because people presumably don't want vulnerabilities in their node modules. And eventually I would expect we want to wait for somebody at least to opt in to saying, when there's a CVE, fail the whole install. Don't let anyone do anything. And similarly, when the signatures are invalid, don't install anything, because I can't trust any of the files anymore. And when the dependency types are invalid, the same reason we want that out of block files. Don't do anything, right? Like warning is just a like, hey, I hope you're paying attention, right? Like unless we're actually failing, we're not getting anything done.
Yeah.
And in particular, in my organization, I want to be able to configure npm RC so that no developer can get any work done when things are broken. I want that to be an alarm, stop the world. You cannot do anything while this is the case, because that way they can't, once the default branch is good, then they can't introduce any further problems.
So would you be willing, Owen, to kind of change this up a little bit then? The RFC then could be, instead of npm install specific, it becomes npm audit, and a subcommand there, you could name it, as Jordan's suggesting, like remote, like has remote depths or something. I don't know.
Yeah, has.
Or
I
don't care.
Another alternative to being very specific to that use case is a more generic npm audit dependency types or whatever that has a default that only allows registry things and local things. And that way, people who can just opt out of it when they want to, using query syntax and command specific config, which should theoretically be built by them.
So dependency type check or something.
Yeah, whatever terminology we've decided for this. Yeah.
Okay, so piggyback this off of npm audit instead. Warn by default. Reference npm deprecate for, well, I guess the output messaging will just be taken care of by npm audit, or do I still have to?
You still have to write that, yeah.
Spec that, okay, no problem. So warn by default, reference npm deprecate for output messaging example.
I copy and pasted the link to that RC in the chat if you want to grab it, Owen.
Sweet. And then as a new bike shetty name, rename to only non-remote depths for now.
Whatever you want. Yeah, like I think Jordan's got a good reference there, like, I don't know, dependency type check. I don't know. Like,
yeah. And the default would be what we've been talking about, right? Just local and registry. But that way we don't have to come up with a command or a config name that's expressive for this. We just have to say, like, here's the default query selector string or whatever, and then like configure it to whatever you want. You know.
I'm just gonna tie in ensure proper communication documentation. To Jordan's point, you know, we should kind of start setting the expectation of the new standard going forward, or at least our recommendations, you know, maybe, yeah. And so last thing then, are we eliminating a predicate on npm query, or would that be like a future RFC? Could I just get
probably, yeah, we can eliminate like the npm audit, like we could add that command to npm audit without adding it to the default install experience, right? Mm-hmm. Like that can happen separately. And if that happens separately, then I'm also way less cagey about having npm query in place before you start warning on git deps, because then it's like really something somebody's opting into running, and then you can go find your git deps. That's fine. My only concern with like adding it to install by default would be that there's no way for you to fix or resolve that problem, like it's similar to the deprecation warnings where it's like, how do I fix this?
Okay,
So
cool. I think I got it. I'm typing the comment in the issue now, so I'll CC you both, and you can just make sure I got it right. And then I'll update the RFC, and then once that goes through, then yeah, we can talk about what it takes to land it from like an actual working committing the code perspective. Okay. Didn't mean to take all the time, but I think it was good to just basically, it's like 99% there, it seems, and seems certainly achievable as is. So thank you for all the feedback. I yield back to the host.
thanks. Thank you. We had a very light agenda. The only other items on there were actually two that we've been discussing for quite a while, which is the dependency selector syntax. No real update there. And Roy says he's roughly 70% complete is what I heard today. I don't know if that's optimistic, judging of where things are at with it. But yeah, I don't know if you want to give an update, Roy, on where we're at with the selector syntax and dependency. Fire. It's on fire. He's on fire. And then I think the only other item we had, which is the run scripts short circuiting on script error. This is number 575. We've been talking about this for a while. I think we have some work queued up now to support the various flags that we wanted to. So I think we can potentially remove this from the agenda because we've talked about it for a number of weeks. Yeah, this is essentially the topological ordering plus like a fail fast mode. Yeah. I think that's it. Did anybody else have any other topics they want to bring up with a few minutes left that we have?
Yeah. I just wanted to mention the things are coming along well. I had one of my little coworkers walking in, so I wasn't able to talk, but it's coming along well. Yeah. And yeah, hopefully we'll have something to show up really soon.
Do we think we're going to want to wait till the conference to show that off, maybe? Or
maybe next week? Do we still have a RFC meeting next week?
Yep. The only week that we're missing is the week that we'll be in Austin.
Oh, yeah. So maybe next week we're going to have something.
Awesome. Cool. Well, that pretty much brings us to time. I appreciate everybody jumping on, and I didn't think we were going to use up the whole hour today. And that was a good one. I appreciate you also like keeping us honest here. We talk about a lot of things and sometimes don't document them or get them rolling into actual RFCs. So yeah, nice deep dive on this. It's definitely something that we've been talking about, like I said, internally quite a bit, and I think it makes a lot of sense, especially when we're hearing about other ecosystems that are getting affected by sort of mutable sources of truth in their graphs. So yeah, thank you so much for having the energy to participate. So.
Yeah, thanks for making a good experience to contribute.
Cool. So we'll see you all next week, I think, and thanks for jumping on today. Cheers.
Have a good one.